Hi everyone, my name's Nat and I am the head of community at Exceptional Individuals. Every Thursday, me and April deliver these webinars and we do them every single Thursday on every single subject you can imagine, normally related to neurodiversity. And today we are going to be taking a brief deep dive into the history of hidden disabilities. Now, as you can imagine, it's not the most sunniest of histories. Actually, it's very gruesome. So excuse me if today's kind of like watching a horrible history. So as I always say, though we are going to be talking about hidden disabilities as a whole, as we are an organization that specializes in neurodiversity, we are going to be having a focus on things like dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, and ADHD. I would say on the whole, though, probably more of a focus on things like autism and ADHD today, but things like dyslexia and dyspraxia will appear. So a little quick thing on what we do in case you're new, because I see some new attendees, but also some familiar faces, which is always nice. We do recruitment for those who are neurodiverse. It can be a right pain to get a job, particularly if you think different. We do training, so maybe some of you are here today because you're like, I would love to know more, but I'm not even sure where to go. We also do a bit of consultancy. That's a fancy word for having a chat about our expertise. We do audits, making sure your website, your systems and policies are up to scratch. We support employees, so just like you would support someone with a physical disability, we support the ones you can't see as well. We do coaching and assessments, which I will cover as always at the end. But what makes us particularly unique is you see this lovely picture here. We are over 80% neurodiverse, so we're experts by experience. We live with it, we breathe it, we help people. You know, when it comes to being neurodivergent, that is where we're coming from today. However, everything today is backed up with sources and references. So drop me a message if you're ever curious to know where we got the information and data from.
Nat, sorry. Hi, it's Anna. Can I just drop something very positive to share with others?
Yeah, go for it.
Because it's related. I've used your organization support, and just last week I received a award letter for access to work. Support, and I've got 90% of the things your colleagues suggested for my ADHD and autism. So I would like to just directly express my gratitude, because I don't think I would get so much support without exceptional individuals and your staff, like your colleagues, supporting me along the way still. So thank you so much. I'm really, really pleased with that support. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anna. Honestly, I'll pay you later. Jokes. Yeah, that was all organic. Honestly, really nice, and it's why we do what we do. So do keep us up to speed on how that's getting along and the training, but I'm so glad you got what you needed. As I said, we do these each Thursday. We do record these. So the one we did last week was Am I Synesthesic? Looking at synesthesia and the characteristics and qualities that come with it. So do check that out if you are curious or want to see our back catalogue. Remember to like and subscribe also. So a brief history of hidden disabilities. And I say brief because it is massive. And after doing the research for this, I really, really want to go so much more deeper. I started going back to the history of time, looking at cave paintings and witch doctors and how we looked at people who were witches. And then I thought, all right, maybe that's going a little bit too far back. So apart from me spelling brief wrong, which I think is very in character, the time period that we're going to focus on today is 100 years. So in the last 100 years, what has happened in the world of hidden disabilities? And I'm going to use the word hidden disabilities as our, where we are today. But throughout this session, we are going to use words like disability, mental health, mental illness, and handicapped, even words which we would no longer use today, because the words that will be used are words that were okay at the time. So I wanted to keep it as historically accurate as I possibly could do. So a first question to all of you to kickstart this off, what are some examples of hidden disabilities? I want you just to list as many as you possibly can do. Anything which you consider to be a hidden disability. Be nice, we've got Tourette's, ASD, ADHD, depression. Any others? Keep them coming. Okay, we've got Jackie's Pit Asperger's, we've got dyspraxia, PTSD, Tourette's syndrome, trauma, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, autism, Tourette's anxiety, a whole lot of them. Now, I can see, obviously, a lot of you are focusing on a lot of neurodivergences, fibrosis, deaf hearing impairments, asthma. Yeah, but these can be a lot bigger. It could be schizophrenia. It could be bipolar. It could be wearing glasses, to be fair, is a hidden disability. Wearing contacts. So anything which impairs you from normal day-to-day life, even if it's mild, would still count as a hidden disability. Remember, a disability doesn't have to be disabling. So you could be technically disabled, but not feel disabled by society. But then again, you very well could be. So it is a very big category. Now, we use hidden disabilities because it sounds a lot more softer than saying mental illness, which obviously a lot of these would no longer come under. But from a historical context, all of these would have been considered as an illness, a disorder, a disability, a mental health concern. So please do not think that I think that any of these are necessarily something which you should be locked up in an asylum for. But history isn't particularly kind. So the next question is, why is the history of hidden disabilities important? Why do we even care? Why are you here today? Does it really matter what happened yesteryear? Or is there a purpose why it's important to have that context? Okay, yeah, we've got yes, it matters, brilliant, but why? We've got to raise awareness of them. Great stuff. Claudia has also said many physical illnesses aren't obvious too. Very, very true. A hidden disability doesn't just have to be mental, though that is, in the brain, though that is probably where we're going to focus on a bit more today. Oh, we got, yes, we can see what went wrong and how we can change it. Absolutely. If we do not remember the past, we are destined to repeat it. And this kind of heavily links back to like World War II. It's why we have Memorial Days, because we can't forget what happened. And we are going to be talking a bit about World War II today, like we'd ever leave it out. So we've got segregation and history of oppression and the emergence of social models of disability and reclaiming language. Very nicely written. Absolutely. Educational, it informs how treatment can be given. History repeats itself and the system is the same. All of these are exactly right. In order to create a safe environment which is inclusive and supportive for everyone, we need to understand what has come before and the mistakes that history has made. Also, remember that history doesn't have to necessarily get better with time. So maybe something in the past was actually better. I think today you're probably going to think that's not the case, but it can be. So we've got to explain to others the needs of better support. So a few questions I want to get, and then we will get to the history. I just want to understand where your views are. So the questions are as followed. I have a negative attitude towards people with mental health problems. And I'm not saying you go and like curse their names, but like, do you have that kind of bias when you're on the streets? When I am a bit depressed or have anxiety, I should have said, I am normal. Do you consider yourself normal, or do you consider yourself disabled? When I see someone else who's depressed, I think of them in a negative way. Do you agree with that or disagree? And do you use words such as idiot, crank, weirdo in your day-to-day language? And I'm not here to judge any of you. Honestly, like, I would be lying if I didn't say sometimes I have a negative opinion or perceived perception of someone who has a disability. Even though this is what I do from a day-to-day life, these thoughts and attitudes are systemic and they can creep in. So I don't think you should necessarily like hide from the fact that you have these thoughts, but you should definitely address them and look to understand where they are coming from. As to whether or not normal, I wanted to ask this, as often we see ourselves as normal, as the benchmark of where people should be. But if someone else had a similar condition, maybe we would look at them as favorably. And there's an interesting story about this and Churchill that we will get onto. When I see someone else who's depressed, I think of them in a negative way. And the words like idiot, crank, weirdo, I know we might use them very like, you idiot, oh, stop being a weirdo, but they're literally based in horrific treatment. We're talking electric shock therapy. We're talking about euthanasia. Like, these words come from a point which is so, so dark. So maybe it's time to like rethink it a little bit. So here's a nice quote from Churchill, lovely chap. He says, feeble-minded, insane classes, while talking about people with mental illnesses, danger which is impossible to extravagate. The source from which the steams of madness is fed should be cut off and sealed up before another year has passed. Eeks. So Churchill basically argued for the mass sterilization of people with mental health issues. I know, history isn't so clear-cut. Yes, he helped win the war for us, and we're not enslaved by Nazi overlords, which is a nice thing. But ultimately, he didn't have the best view of people with disabilities. This was 100 years ago, though, and he was fairly young when he said this. Whether or not he changed his views in later years, who to say? But it is interesting to know that it wasn't just people on the wrong side of history who had these horrible views. Sunjan says, this is from someone who suffered from depression himself. Yes, you are in the know. Churchill did suffer from depression himself. Now, to feel the need to eliminate a whole body of people by sterilization is an idea that who else had? Was it Stalin, Hitler, or the KKK? Now, I know what you're thinking, oh, Nat, you're getting a bit extreme. You jumped from Churchill, who everyone loves, to Hitler. And the point I want to make is, yes, they kind of do relate, and history really depends on the victor. It does bring up lots of interesting questions on, we're always trying to get rid of one section of the population, but we are going to be talking a lot about World War II today. So I'm not necessarily saying any of my personal opinions as much as I'm able to, but I do think we should always question decisions. Was it made from a political standpoint, a personal standpoint, or something in between? So as Sanjan rightly mentioned, Churchill himself did suffer with depression and possibly even bipolar. Now, 2 questions. Did he call his depression his black dog? And when Churchill was talking about his very non-progressive ways of talking about what we should do with mental illness, do you think he was talking about himself included? Yeah, so he did call it his black dog, which is a really interesting analogy. He would be like, it's not part of him, but it is something that follows him. There's a really interesting YouTube video about the black dog, which we did in a training video a while back. But yeah, when Churchill was talking about what we should do with those people with mental illnesses, he wasn't including himself. And that's very typical of the history. We do not include ourselves when thinking about what we want to do with other people, even though there's a lot of overlap. It's definitely interesting. And some of Churchill's views and opinions haven't held up that well over time. Is it a product of his time, or was it wrong at the time? I'm not the best person to ask, but definitely an interesting question nevertheless. So we're going to be going over 100 years. 100 years, a lot has happened. From the place where we are today, which is about champion strengths, to locking people up for a whole life for not being able to concentrate and sit still well. So we're going to start off with a bit of shell shock, which what we now call today is PTSD. Then we're going to go on about malaria-induced fever. That might sound pretty horrific, but actually it was really progressive at the time. Essentially, it was about giving someone malaria in order to cure mental illness. We've got different types of electrical therapy. We've got injecting people with insulin to intentionally put them in a coma. We've got different acts that the government have done. We've got lobotomy, which is essentially drilling a hole in someone's head and drilling the mental health away. That doesn't work. But there are some science backgrounds in it. We got different things about acts, groups, and charities, leaders with mental health, groups like Mencap forming. We've got different drugs that were tested, some good, some not so good. We've got the government putting lots of money into the system, but maybe it wasn't for the right reasons. We'll talk about that soon. And we've got lots of different things, plans, and eventually, the history is long, we are going to get to where we are in modern day. Starting off, World War One. Danny, you might remember it. I'm afraid I wasn't there. Jokes. But World War One really wasn't that long ago. And over 306 people that we know of from the British soldiers and the Commonwealth were executed. They were killed by their own team because of cowardice. What is cowardice? How can you judge that? But it's nowadays that we realize that it wasn't cowardice. They weren't kind of acting the way they were acting because they were scared or deserting the army or the forces. It was most likely because they had PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. And there's a movement now to get these individuals exonerated. All that means is, in history, they were killed because they were cowards. But now we should reevaluate that and said, we killed them because we were ignorant, because we didn't understand how mental health affects in individuals, and they shouldn't be viewed from this part in their life. So really interesting. Moving on from there, we've then got the first treatment of mental illnesses. And this involved jabbing someone with a nice little bit of malaria, get their body heating up, and see how it works. Now, you might think this sounds ridiculous, that it did work for some, but with a lot of these things, arguably it did more harm than good. So just because there is like one or two positive things didn't necessarily mean this was the way forward. These days, we wouldn't say if someone had autism, giving them malaria isn't going to help it. It's just going to give them malaria. But it is interesting to see how we have kind of developed and changed over time. Moving on to the Roaring Twenties, we've got the precursor to electro-convulsive therapy. And this is zapping the mental illness out of someone. So if someone has depression, anxiety, bipolar, all you need to do is prod them with an electric probe, and fingers crossed, it would sort it out. And as always, there's good and bad in everything. There is a place for electric therapy, but in the way it was done back in the 20s, wasn't the most progressive. So lateral cerebral diaphragmia, which eventually means brain zapping, was a predecessor to electro-convulsive therapy. It was used to jolt psychosis patients back to normality. You may not be surprised to realize that it didn't zap people back to normal. In many ways, it made them a lot worse. Now, 7 years from that. Insulin-induced comas. This was pretty horrific. If someone was really struggling with mental health, what are we to do? Well, we could just put them in a coma. I mean, that's going to sort them right out. Not. So insulin-induced comas and convulsions, when the body kind of vibrates, was used to treat schizophrenia. Now, you might think, Nat, yeah, I get this, but how does this relate to neurodiversity? Well, autism used to be considered a form of schizophrenia. Lots of people who nowadays would be diagnosed with ASD were diagnosed with schizophrenia back in the day. So imagine that your child who has autism today, they may have put in a coma because they thought that when they wake up, it would help. There is a series called Chicago Med. My mum loves that series. And one of the characters is autistic, and he went for electrotherapy. At the beginning, it helped, but eventually he said it's not changed the beginning, and essentially it's not changed the fact I'm autistic. I need to learn how to deal with myself. You are absolutely right. We should not look at mental illness as something that we need to treat necessarily. But be careful, because again, autism, mental illness, technically there may be truth in some parts of it, but nowadays we don't use that, because ultimately it is debilitating due to the society we live in, not necessarily due to the condition itself. But things like schizophrenia can be very distressing for individuals. This is why the line does blur, and it's not always as clear cut as we may like. Then we've got insulin comas, very similar. Again, it worked, but 3 out of 22 people originally died of it. Not great. Moving on to the Mental Act. Finally, the government's like, we should probably do something and have policies in place. So originally, it was called a lunatic asylum. I know, it's not just Batman where they have asylums. These were real places where they're like, oh, criminally insane, let's lock you up because we don't know what to do with you. So in the 1930s, this was changed to a mental hospital. Much more, and I'd say it's a good change. You know, maybe it's not the best change, but I'd rather be in a mental hospital than an insane asylum. So we are moving, we're getting a bit progressive now. We're starting to see some changes. And then we go backwards of steps with lobotomy. Now, if any of you have ever heard of this, again, there is a place in science for it, but at the stage where we were when this was done, we're not talking that progressive. We're talking literally about putting something up the nose in the brain. And the idea is to relieve the pressure and fix the human brain. It doesn't work like that. This is wrong on a lot of levels. So neurologist Mines performed a Lobotomy to treat mental illness, which involved drilling holes in the patient's skulls to access the brain. You probably have guessed by now, this doesn't work. And I certainly wouldn't like this to treat my autism. We got things like MRI scans now, which we use instead, which is far better because it's non-invasive and you can see how the brain is working. This is what happened to Kennedy's sister. Oh, thanks, Bethany. I think I heard of that, but I don't know too much about that. So now we've got the grandmother of it all. And finally, probably a good person in history. Nice, thank you. It only took to the 1939s, just before the 40s, before we had some actually good movement. So the National Association of Mental Health, which we now know as the charity Mind, formed. And this was because no one was doing anything. The government wasn't really working. So the individuals of the public took it upon themselves to take a stand and say, we should have a base. So yeah, you might see Mind like charity shops in the high street, and you might think, oh, that looks quite like a newish organization. Actually, it's even older than organizations like Mencap. Really interesting history. Next, we've got Churchill. As I mentioned, he often talked about his black dog. However, he also didn't particularly favor other people. Churchill was a really interesting character. Some people said he had dyslexia. Other people said he did it just because he wanted the underdog story. He's one of those people who you either believe or you don't believe. You either think he's good or you think he's bad. But what I would say is he wrote a lot of his autobiographies himself, which means he told his story from his narrative. So do take, everything he says with a pinch of salt, but also know that though we may have believed he had bipolar, we don't know because no one tested him back then. So though we are saying it's believed, we don't really know. However, some experts have studied and kind of come to some sort of conclusion that they think his achievements were not despite it, but because of it. And had we had a leader who was more stable in how he regulated his emotions, maybe we wouldn't have had the right leader needed at the time to win the war. So here is a quote from the book Black Dog. Kafka, Mice, and Other Phenomena of the Human Mind by Anthony Storr. Churchill, he had been a stable and equable man. He could never have inspired the nation. In 1940, when all the odds was against Britain, a leader of sober judgment might well have concluded. This just means that we probably would have lost the war had we not had someone who potentially had a mental illness. Anna says it's interesting that Boris likes Churchill very much. Yeah, it's hard not to get too political when you go into these matters, but all I can say is he's an interesting character. We briefly mentioned Mencap, and this is another charity. So now we've got two organizations that want to help, but this Mencap was different from the others. Judy Fried, who was the founder, was a mother of a child who had learning disabilities. And she was like, my whole entire life is taken up through looking after my disabled child. She wasn't against it, but she felt that there should be support in place. There should be like institutions. In the 1940s, if you had a disability, you weren't really allowed to go to school. There wasn't particularly institutions, there wasn't systems, there wasn't social services in place. So parents rose up and took control of it. And this also included things like autism and dyslexia. Dole says, what about the meth rumors? I don't know. So the association, just to clarify, I think you were talking about Churchill, probably not Judy. I don't think Judy did that. So the Association of Parents of Backwards Children, yeah, okay, I know what you're thinking. Backwards Children, not the most progressive name, but it has since changed. I think terminology is always moving around. Was formed by parents concerned about the lack of support to help them maintain a child at home. So remember, at this time, you were essentially anchored to your child because no one else would support you with looking after them. In the 1950s, we realized we can treat everything by pumping drugs into people. So, and excuse my pronunciations, Thorazine, the brand name for chlorpheniramine, was marketed as a medication to treat many of the symptoms associated with schizophrenia. Essentially, this was a miracle drug at the time. Every time someone had anxiety, every time someone felt anxious or depressed, they would pump this drug. And this is an advertisement from the time. And it was a brand and it was actively marketed. If any of you saw films like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, you'll realize that they just give meds all the time. This wasn't a miracle solution. And again, sometimes it made matters worse than better. We are obviously focusing a lot on what we can eventually think of quite severe mental illnesses. But the reason why this is relevant to hidden disabilities is that back then it was all grouped together. It didn't matter whether or not you were suicidal or if you had ADHD. To them, you know, it was the same. Bethany says, why is it still most charities are run by parents of disabled children, not by people who are themselves disabled? Looking at autistic charities in particular. Do you know what, Bethany? It's a good point. I don't have an answer for that, but I do think a lot of organizations are becoming more, they are becoming more progressive. They're having people who say have autism on the boards as trustees. Obviously, I would love to see it one day that we had some of them at the head. I think it paints a very positive message, but I see where you're coming from. Okay, hopefully you're all doing good. I know this is a lot, but interesting nevertheless. Then the government, in the UK at least, is like, let's throw money at it. So almost half of the National Health Service, the NHS hospital beds, were for mental illnesses or mental defects. That's a lot. So what are we going to do? All the beds are filled up. So substantial, if not inadequate, sums of money for the improvements were set aside. Now, this is really interesting because this seems like a good thing, doesn't it, in principle? The government realizes that there's something needs to be done. So a lot of money, even though it wasn't enough, was set aside. But what does this really mean? Does this mean more hospitals, more asylums? Does it mean less diagnosing? Well, let's have a look into it. Because one thing we will learn is that not everything is as cut and dry as we might think. Dole says, would the nation's social welfare be obliterated if all charities disappeared overnight? Well, it's a good point, actually. And the government doesn't want charities to disappear because actually they do the work for them. It's kind of like if you have them, people get support. But if you have them, the government doesn't step up. It's interesting where we think what should be the responsibility of the state and what should be the responsibility of the public privately. Again, not necessarily a right answer for that. But we did get some legislation when the UK government at least stepped in. So in 1959, there was this act, right, called the Mental Health Act. And it reads as followed: an act to repeal the Lunacy and Mental Treatment Act and Mental Deficiency Act, and to make fresh provisions with respect to the treatment and care of mental disordered persons with respect to their property and affairs. So what does this mean? It means that finally, people who are considered mental or disabled are human beings. Before this point, you were not allowed to vote. You were not allowed to have your houses and your possessions. Essentially, you were as good as a prisoner. Your human rights were non-existent. So this act was a big step in the right direction. It's like you cannot treat people as if they were subhuman. They are real people. So this was a big landmark at the time, but still a long, long way to go to get true reform. But part of that reform was about tearing down these hospitals, or what used to be known as asylums. These were awful places. They were just like cramming everyone together, and they were oversubscribed. They weren't built for the capacity that they were being held into. Following an investigation from different newspapers, medias, it was found that hospitals, such as the Ely Hospital, had a series of scandals. We're talking about people killing people, overdosing, hitting, abuse, all that. Again, think of like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And this was like slammed all over the papers. And this was really bad press for the government. They had to do something. So they shut these organizations down, which seems like a good thing, right? But where do we then put the individuals who need the care? Now we've got a lot of people and not enough organizations. So this is when, in 1962, the hospital plan came into fruition. The plan was to cut mental illness beds from 151,899 to 99090. So essentially, get rid of them all. So out of 109 mental illness hospitals, they dropped it to 87. So again, this might seem like a good thing because, well, if they were so terrible, we should get rid of them, right? Well, yes, we should have. But what do we do then? We then put all the people who had severe challenges in regular hospitals, in like just put them to members of the public. This wasn't a good thing because though asylums weren't great, the concept of having an institution which is created and designated for people who have additional needs is a good one. So now we have people getting less tailored support. For the record, places that mental health hospitals weren't all bad. Some of them did real good as well. But as always, not all were created equal. And now in the 1964, you are starting to see that more and more we're having to change things. So we had to get rid of all of these kind of like inmates to patients were changing. So before, if you committed a crime and you had mental illness, you were a prisoner, you were a criminal, a convict. But then around the 60s, they started to like rebrand it and say, well, actually, now you're a patient. We're looking at it from a different lens. Winwick Hospital, which was notorious, by the way, was not a great place, saw many changes. They moved from a custodial role to a more treatment-orientated role. This was a big step. So before, let's say you have high needs autism, what they would do, they'd put you in a hospital, lock you up, chain you up, and basically not give you daylight. Sounds like a prison. They moved that towards giving people treatment, giving them windows, allowing people to walk outside. It almost sounds like suddenly we weren't battery farmed animals, we were more free ranged. Again, still a long way to go, but we are starting to see a movement into a genuine, more positive direction. And we're still talking about things like neurodiversity at this stage because we still didn't see the difference. It was still one of the same. Now, in the late 60s, we're changing attitudes to homosexuality. What, Nat? Why are you talking about homosexuality now? I thought we were talking about mental illness. Again, homosexuality is not a mental illness, okay? Homosexuality is not a mental illness. But in 1967, it was viewed as such. And that is why it is part of the history, whether or not we like it or not. This is an image of someone receiving the therapy. They would essentially blast attractive women and say, be straight, be straight. And guess what? That actually resulted in mental health difficulties. Yeah, it didn't help. So there was a bill to legalize homosexuality that essentially just got through the government. It almost nearly did not pass. And this was moving towards the end of trying to cure something which didn't need to be cured. And this relates to autism in a big way, because autism was still trying to be cured. And this was the first step to say, actually, maybe there are some things in society that we may not all agree with, but don't need to be cured and are just a thing. So this is a big part of the history of autism, even though it might seem completely separate. It kind of paved the way to the way we think of things, like just thinking differently as we do today. Education for all, woohoo! 70s, we're moving on up now. Up until the 70s, you were not entitled to education. If you had a learning disability, just stay at home and play with Lego. I don't know, but you weren't entitled to go to school. Finally, you had to have some education. From, I think it was 6 to 15, you were entitled to have education. Now, you still had different schools for people who had different abilities, those with dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, or what we just back then would just call like learning difficulties or learning challenges. They might not have the same level or the same quality of education, but they did have education. And again, this was a good step, a really positive step. The schools were still terrible, but at least they had schools. Next, we've got community-based nursing. This was another big step. So remember, beforehand, we had essentially insane asylums and prisons. Then we had hospitals, and now we're moving towards helping people in a community base, going to their homes. How are you doing? Checking up on them, making it more of a personal care. So Winwick Hospital, which was, again, one of the worst at the time, started this project where they started discharging patients. This was relatively a good thing, but it was also kind of kickstarted by the fact there were no longer any beds. There was no space in the inn. So we had to start moving people out of these institutions. So again, pros and cons on this one. We will see after this why community-based nursing might sound really good, but with most things, maybe the government had a different agenda to why it was really pushing this on those with mental challenges. And this brings us to everyone's favorite Prime Minister, Maggie Thatcher, the Iron Lady. Love her or hate her, she was instrumental in one way or another to pushing the narrative along. So yes, care in the community was around before the 80s. It happened in the 50s. You know, there was even some of it in the 40s. But the reason why her government particularly pushed it is that there was a deliberate, essentially, underfunding and mismanagement to these institutions, because essentially they were hemorrhaging money. So she thought, okay, if we stop the money, they are going to collapse, and then the general public are going to be with us in getting rid of them. So she started putting the emphasis more on the community and kind of spun it to look like a positive thing. Yes, the community is now going to take charge of looking after those more vulnerable. It's not too dissimilar from the big society that was pushed down our throats a few years ago. I do find it very interesting where, depending on what side of the political spectrum you fall on, you might have saw this as a good thing or a disastrous thing. Yeah, Bethany says that sounds familiar. Yeah, it does. History does tend to repeat itself quite a lot. So here is Margaret Thatcher. Did she do more harm than good by pushing the kind of the attitudes that mental health should be dealt with on a more personal level? Okay, so far we've got 100% harm. Yeah, you know what? I don't know. Like, there was definitely elements of harm. For instance, getting rid of dedicated places. Essentially, she started privatizing all of our government, all of our public resources. And that meant that it kind of led to where we are today. Everybody knows mental health is incredibly underfinanced. And I'm not putting it all on the Iron Lady, but she definitely didn't help matters. And a lot of where we are today is like a ripple of where we were back in the 80s. It's pushing it on to the individual to absolve any collective responsibility for each other. Yep, personally was ideal, it was practical. The practice that wasn't, yep. Again, it sounds good, but the implementation wasn't great. We're almost up to present day now. And as you can see, ups and downs, but genuinely on the up. Only in the 80s were people who had mental illnesses in hospitals were allowed to register to vote. I know, why weren't we allowed to vote? It's like, yep, you're not capable, you're insane in the membrane, you aren't allowed to participate in government. This was wrong on so many levels. For starters, politicians will only make laws and represent you if you are valuable to them. You are only valuable to them if you are someone who is able to vote for them. So they had no incentive before 83 to champion the rights of people who had mental illness. Now they did. And this was a big, big step. Now we are finally into the 90s. What a great decade, eh? So Rainhill, which was a hospital in Merseyside, finally shut. And this was a really big deal because this was the biggest prison for people with mental illnesses in all of Europe. They had at one point in 1936, 3,000 inmates. That is a lot of people. Were these people all dangerous? No. These were people that, like my colleagues who have like autism, they could have been in there. You know, we aren't talking about like people like the Joker off of Batman who's like in a straight jacket who's going to like kill everyone. We're talking about just people that society just couldn't deal with or didn't know how to work with. So shutting this down, even though it wasn't like an insane asylum in 1995, was still a very symbolic gesture to say, yep, no more, done with it. I think they've now turned it into housing. So yeah, we're getting there. The next one to close was Winwick. And we've mentioned Winwick a few times. This was a particularly notorious one because this was the one where the scandals came out, where the abuse was documented. So though not the biggest one, it was one of the oldest ones with some of the nastiest reputations. And this was in operation for 100 years. I hate to think about all the ghosts that kind of like lurk around that place, but we are clearing out the closet. We're getting rid of all this junk. Modern day now, 2006, crisis housing. Crisis housing is essentially a safe place for short-term support. So maybe you've had a mental breakdown, maybe you're potentially at risk of hurting yourself. This is where you can go and look after yourself. And this was interesting because in 2006, Wales didn't have any. So this was the first time Wales had a crisis housing. And at the time, it was still their only one. And this is a hospital for people who are too well to remain in their own homes. But it was more of a home. It was more a place you can walk around, have a cup of tea, a safe environment. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been to a crisis house. I visited them many a times. I can't talk too positively about them, but what I will say is that they have come on leaps and bounds from the original insane asylum to a place where they bring dogs in to allow you to pet them. They have colouring, they have different groups. It is a long way. So ultimately, I think crisis housing is a safe place where you do not have to feel like a prisoner. And not all the time, unless you're sectioned, a lot of the time they are voluntary. So you can come and you can go as you please, which is a much more holistic approach. And how can we stop history repeating itself? We spoke about why it was important. Well, the Care Quality Commission really helps us make sure that we do not repeat the mistakes of the past. This is a non-governmental department which is affiliated with the Department of Health that regulates health and social care. So, with in schools, we have something called Ofsted where you're like, good, satisfactory, we get the same thing. So all hospitals, schools, institutions get a rating. Good, meh, bad. This essentially holds people to account. This makes sure that quality doesn't dip below an unacceptable level. So I'm all for this type of regulation. And it does mean that you can actively view these things. You can Google it online and you can find out how different institutions are rated. Sunjan says, people who with severe illnesses I know say they are safe places to go for crisis. Yeah, and I really think genuinely, I know people whose lives have been saved through having those safe spaces. So I do not think they're all equal, but I do think some of them are world-class care. And I'd be interested to know for those of you who aren't in the UK, what is the landscape your side? And the very last one, before we are all up to date, and apologies, I obviously missed some steps because there's a lot of history, is where we are today. No longer do we see everything related to the brain which isn't considered normal as an illness, as criminal, as insanity. Now we have lots of different categories. So you have mental illness, acquired, you have neurodiversity, disability, different ways of learning. And we realize that they're all different and as a result should all be treated differently. But more so than just treated differently, we're also at the stage now where we realize maybe they don't need to be treated. Maybe it's more about how society sees and views it. I'm not here saying that some people do need medication, some people do need crisis support, but there's a lot of people who just need an empathetic ear and some patience. So now we're at a place where we try to talk about people's strengths. Rather than what they can't do, we talk about what they can do. And we are at the start of this movement. This is still not cemented in our culture, but we are at a place where we're at least talking about it. Organizations like Exceptional Individuals would not exist if communities weren't actively adopting the ability of first strength-based approach. We just want to be listened to. We don't need medication. We don't need zapping. We don't need things drilled in our head. Sometimes we just need someone to listen to us and say, I might not understand what you're going through, but I acknowledge it and I'm here to listen. So just to quickly end up on things before I finish up for the day, because I appreciate this was a heavy, heavy, heavy subject, but really important. If any of you do have mental health challenges, neurodiversity, we're not saying that it's something that needs to be cured, but it's important to appreciate there are challenges in a world which wasn't designed for you. And as such, in the UK at least, there are government grants such as access to work, which Anna mentioned earlier that you can apply to. I highly encourage you, if you are working in the UK, get in contact because there is support available. And if you're not in the UK and if you're not in work, still get in contact with us, because though this particular scheme may not be applicable to you, there is support elsewhere that we might be able to signpost you to. Nice, we've got some people waiting for assessments as well. So while we have a few minutes left, any last questions or statements or thoughts that you would like to share? Oh, Claudia says, thanks very much for your thoughtful, provoking and interesting. You are very welcome. Maybe I got a little bit too personal on this one than I would normally do, but it's a really, a very emotional setting. Oh, and she says, you are all brilliant people. Don't forget it. Great stuff. Well, what I will do is leave this for another day, right? So you can always get in contact if you have any thoughts or questions later on. But just to end on with, the one we're doing next week, if you love today and you want more of it, is the science of ADHD drugs. So on June the 30th, we are going to be doing a bit of a crash course on what drugs are available for ADHD. Are they good? Are they bad? What do they do? How do they affect the brain? So we're getting a little bit technical. So do get involved. And as you can see, if you aren't able to attend, don't worry about it. Go onto our YouTube, subscribe now, and you can see a whole catalogue of other events that we have done throughout the years. Here's a lot of lists. We've got what we got. We've got the science of drugs, then we've got dyslexia across culture, we've got autism and sex, not as dirty as it sounds. We're just talking about chromosomes. We've got discrimination, we've got dyslexia stupid trait, which basically means how the media views us. And we also have lots of others. So do check them out. But if you want to get in contact, drop us an email. Come say hello. And I really hope that you enjoyed today. And it gave you a bit of an insight to how far we have come as a society in only 100 years. We have a long way to go. But my God, have we made incredible progress. So thank you all very much for attending today. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your Thursdays. Cool. Bye, everyone. Thank you all for the lovely comments.